This is going to be a retrospective on the free entries in the Pac-Man World series, a series of 3D platformers released between 1999 and 2005, starting as a celebration of Pac-Man's 20th anniversary and ending on his 25th. And I realise right off the bat that any would-be mathematicians amongst you will be calling bullshit, but all I can say is not to worry about it. Yes, it's jumping the gun a bit, but it's slightly less wrong in Europe and Australia. Over the course of this video, I'll be looking at the stages, gameplay, and collectibles, and charting changes from game to game. They are mostly 3D platformers that make heavy use of collectible items and have varying degrees of linear stage design. All three share more or less the same core elements, the same basic moveset, however there is one move Pac-Man can never settle on. Most of the same collectibles remain, and of course each game shares a setting. However, each game does change up how important each individual element is. I will also confess that I am bad at Pac-Man. And when I say Pac-Man, I mean Pac-Man. I enjoy it in very short bursts. I'd like to think I've gotten better at it over the course of the series, as all three of the games feature mazes in some fashion, but they all treat mazes differently, so maybe not. All three of the games also have classic Pac-Man bundled in as well, so if you just want to be able to play classic Pac-Man, you really can't go wrong with any of these. I also didn't know Pac-Man had a personality beforehand, and had never really tried to imagine one for him before. I didn't expect to find him as fascinating as I did, but I've come to like the guy. One last note, each of these are being played emulated. The first on Mednafen for the PlayStation 1, and the latter two on Dolphin. Save for one case in Pac-Man World 3 of rev plates being balked, they are accurate. We open the series with Pac-Man World 20th Anniversary, developed by Namco for the PlayStation 1. I'll say up front that this one, while fun, is quite rough. It's got a good number of flaws, feels rather experimental, like it's trying to catch up on 3 years of 3D platformers in one go. We open on a bright and cheery day. It's about 7 months until Pac-Man's 20th and the festivities are about to start. They're interrupted, however, as everyone on their way to the party is kidnapped. He's just dead. Returning from work, Pac-Man finds his home in shambles and everyone pac-napped. Watch closely, since this is the last time in the series we'll see Pac-Man showing anything approaching fear. As Pac-Man heads out, he finds a flyer, saying that he'll be live and in person on Ghost Island. And in that moment, any fear he had turns to sheer, focused anger. We cut to Ghost Island, and a celebration I can't judge the timing of is underway. The mood will not last long, however.
Boss!
No,
Toc-Man!
no, you idiots! I wanted gold streamers and red balloons! The DJ stinks, the banners are crooked, and the cake should be chocolate! You're gonna ruin my party!
Boss!
What do you want?
Pac-Man's here on Ghost Island! The Pac-Man!
Note that reaction, the sheer terror his name invokes. There's a reason the game's cover shows Ghosts happy that Pac-Man is leaving. It seems the plan was a carpet kidnapping that got everyone but Pac-Man. With the party disrupted and his plans threatened, Toc-Man orders Pac-Man found and destroyed.
Find him and destroy him!
Yeah, he's looking forward to this. Our tutorial is on Buccaneer Beach. We'll get run through a few of the game's mechanics and common obstacles. It's a 3D side-scroller. That doesn't mean we have several lanes. No, Pac-Man has 8-directional digital movement and can stop and start on a dime. This 8-directional movement can cause problems. But to balance that out, he's also got perfect mid-air control. Perfect as in, he can stop and change direction in mid-air just as easily as he can on the ground, which is to say, near instantly. So a majority of the time the platforming, even for distant jumps, is quite easy, as outside of high jumps and some select circumstances, you don't really need to dedicate time or plan out your jumps. Pac-Man will also grab onto platforms in the case of near misses, giving you even greater leeway. However, on moving platforms, and more so rotating ones, Pac-Man does actually start carrying momentum. It's a little bit jarring the first time it happens, and while moving platforms are fine, rotating ones can be bastards. Pac-Man can also take 4 hits before going down, which is more than enough to just tank your way through a lot of the challenges. His hardiness, however, is hampered by his hitbox, which is larger than Pac-Man himself. This is by accident, not design, and it does mean that you will get hit by things that by all rights you should have dodged. Pac-Man's rocking 3 techniques: the butt bounce, the rev roll, and dot throwing. The tutorial goes through some of the applications of each and how they work with many of the game's spanning gimmicks, such as switches for activating stage elements, rev pads for moving through certain obstacles, chests for braking, chrome pellets for invincibility and walking underwater, fruit doors for hiding switches and other goodies behind, bidoings for bouncing around, and hills and ramps to rev roll off of. While each world does have some of its own unique gimmicks, these obstacles make up the skeleton of each. So, after beating Buccaneer Beach, we make it to the hub world of Ghost Island. It's pretty simple, just doors to access different stages. Ghost Island is made up of 6 themed worlds with 3 stages and a boss fight each. Each world also has a family member that you can save, so let's dig into the moves a bit more and begin the massacre. So while the basic movement is fine, Pac-Man's moveset is really well done. 2 of his 3 moves pack in a lot of utility and are quite fun to make use of. The butt bounce functions as the best attack. It's easier to aim than the 2 others, and can be spammed endlessly on top of this. It can switch off enemies and switch on switches. Besides this, its most interesting function is as a high jump. A butt bounce will generate greater height than a regular leap. Since you have to hit the ground to trigger it, it's a little bit more thoughtful than, say, a double jump or an air dash. It's not a move that can be used in desperation, tossed out when a jump is misjudged and it's too late to turn back. It does also add an element of timing when a high jump has to be made under duress. The rev roll works as an attack, a way to clear bigger gaps if you have a ramp. It can also get you up hills, but in what must be an oversight, so can the butt bounce. It's also obviously a way to move faster. The rev up is used to move rev pads found out in the world. So while this still has plentiful utility, 8-directional movement and the camera means it has a lot going against it. It's very hard to aim, you can't shift direction mid-roll. Using it in most areas is a bit of a gamble since you can't see too far to the sides, and while this is purposeful, it doesn't carry momentum if you jump mid-roll. So outside of ramps, it is not used as a long jump. There is a small issue with the rev roll. When you need to jump between rev pads, which when you do will often be above pits, if you hold the rev button and jump, you will perform a small hop. This is because hitting the rev button in midair kills your movement and drops you down. This small hop makes moving from pad to pad simple. This sounds good, and it is. Most of the time it's very handy. There is a critical moment where it's not. Finally, throwing dots picks up some offensive slack. It's handy for aerial enemies and a handful of foes immune to butt bouncing. Unfortunately, outside of its practicality, it's an awkwardly ranged move. Don't bother trying to angle shots by jumping higher, it will still hit uncomfortably close to you. It also uses up pack dots as ammunition. Thankfully, they're everywhere. So combat is not a major part of the game. Enemies are there, but they are more in service of the obstacles. They tend to function more like killable hazards, and they tend to go down in one shot. The 3-dimensional stages also mean they are very easily skirted. Enemies aren't all that litter the stages. These titles are heavy on collectibles. Hunting down and gathering items is a major part of the gameplay. Besides the pack dots used for both score and ammunition, there are pack trails for getting to higher ground, or at times to nab a pickup in style. We've got health wedges for recovering health, extra lives which are plentiful but not because of pickups, rather plentiful checkpoints, letters spelling out the word Pac-Man which will grant access to a bonus stage if you get them all, and on these stages you can get further fruits and lives. The fruits act as keys for numerous fruit doors, and their payment for spins on a rather literal fruit machine at the end of each stage. Also returning are ghosts and with them power pellets. Eating the ghosts is optional, but it does give you a score boost and some health if you nab them all. The game tends to litter ghost areas with power pellets, so you're rarely in danger of timing out. Some spots do get clever with it, however. Chrome pellets act as both temporary invincibility and they weigh you down in water, letting you open up chests and take out enemies. Typically, if you see some chests while swimming, take note, you're likely going to be seeing a chrome pellet soonish. Unlike most other collectibles, this is actually something of a test of timing, so there is some skill involved in nabbing them. You'll also once in a blue moon see a power pellet that allows a single butt bounce to be a screen clearer. It's not very useful overall, since the butt bounce is also your high jump, and enemies are not terribly dangerous most of the time. It doesn't cause problems, it's just largely superfluous. Then there are keys, 1 per world, used to unlock cages and free a friend. The key in the cage will not necessarily be in the same level. Finding them in and of itself isn't hard, but the thought of missing them sat with me, and I'll explain why as we go along. So let's talk about gambling. If you have enough dots, you'll play the slots. This is for extra lives and bonus points. Bonus points give you extra lives, so it's really just extra lives. The slots are always in the same order, and 3 Galaxians are a jackpot. Plus, each reel is the same. So once you work out the order, you can start hitting Galaxians consistently, and tend to cash out stages with far more lives than you entered with. I only game overed once, and all that does is kick you back to a somewhat sabotaged main menu. Lastly, there are Galaxians. You cash these in at the Galaxian door, and this leads to a maze, which are interesting. Each maze takes on the look and occasionally the mechanics of the stage it's found in. Unlike regular old mazes, you bring your health bar and lives into the mazes, and you kinda need to. These mazes start pretty straightforward but become absolute bastards, featuring more than the regular old 4 ghosts and stage hazards. I'd often get into situations where damage was essentially guaranteed. Damage taken and lives lost in the maze also carry over to the stage proper. The maze's purpose is collecting more dots and fruits for greater score and more spins of the wheel. They are entirely optional. And that's pretty much all we'll be gathering on our trip through Ghost Island. Let's wrap up Pirate and get into each world and how all these elements actually feel in gameplay. Pirate World breaks you in quite easily. The first stage is heavy on water and multi-leveled stages as opposed to bottomless pits, which will become far more common later. Water itself isn't terribly threatening as Pac-Man has an endless lung capacity and there isn't really anything dangerous down there. In the second and third stages it does ramp up pretty quickly, going from easily platforming without much risk to far more precise, time-sensitive jumps above certain death. We're scaling the battlements, and I'm afraid it's too late to use a cannon against Pac-Man. They're actually helping him now. It ends with a rather easy boss fight where you can bounce cannonballs back at a flying ship with very lenient timing. Pirate World overall is a good introduction, jolly music and whimsical enemies. The skeletons and ghosts share their home. We're going to learn that's more than the Pac-People could ever claim. Then we get to the ruins. Again, the first stage is very easy, if a bit dull due to its gimmick being darkness, but then it ramps up even harder with many drops, platforming over certain death with unfavourable camera angles, and far more crushes and hazards. Plus it has the most annoying projectile in the entire series, homing tornadoes that require very precise timing to jump and are slightly faster than you. Each world utilises this difficulty curve, with the first stage being a very simple introduction, and the second and third ramping up sharply. Ruins then ends with Anubis Rex, which I'm going to give its own segment as it is a truly awful boss fight. Anubis Rex opens with a short second-person segment where Pac-Man is running away from a monster, dodging spikes that are triggered by proximity. Proximity being Pac-Man's slightly too large hitbox, and if you don't want to get hit, you're going to need to rev roll a couple of times. It's tricky, but you can get through it without taking a hit. I pulled it off once and then was never capable of it again. It's a bit of a bastard. After that short, strange intro, we are into the boss proper. It starts off simple enough, then you hit it a few times. It's a fucking nightmare. We have to jump between 4 rev pads. We spin them up, and this reveals a weak point we have a small window to get back and land a hit on. Once done, the rev pads reset, and the stage gets more hazardous. There is a small saving grace in that there is a checkpoint placed between each hit. This is much appreciated due to the length of time between hits, and also because of all of the following reasons. What starts as manageable devolves into everything exploding, burnt to a crisp by an ancient death laser, or swept up in a tornado. These obstacles do not sync up in ways that make dodging all of them at once entirely possible. Nothing is worse than the fact that I can get all 4 rev plates, get caught by a tornado because I have to dodge a fireball or a laser or another fireball, and the tornado will then hold me in place for so long that the weak point will close off. If there is a surefire pattern to dodging these obstacles, I cannot see it. So, first off, we've got projectile spam that doesn't sync up well. Those tornadoes are also homing projectiles, as mentioned before, and are extraordinarily hard to dodge with a normal jump, unless you time it so that they're in the gaps between rev pads, in which case they're lower, which the projectile spam may not give you the luxury of doing. I should also remind you that Pac-Man's hitbox was accidentally made larger than him. Health wedges do also appear in the stage between hits, however they are only there for a short time, and they are placed on one of the rev pads, a place that you need to go, so you can't save them up for when you would really need them. It's not like there isn't a large stretch of stage they could be placed on so that you could play well early and stock up for Armageddon, Now, remember what I talked about with rev pads and jumping between them and the short hop and the fact that hop works most everywhere else in the game? Well, these rev pads are placed too far apart, so now that muscle memory I had developed and was working for me is now working against me. I have to stop revving, take my finger off the button, and then make a normal jump. It only takes a tiny bit more time once I had unlearned that behavior, but with this much going on, that tiny bit is rather valuable. Fortunately, this is the series' most boring world and worst boss down in one. So now we're on the up and up. Seriously, we're going to space next. I never would have figured the Ghost would build a space elevator, but hey, why not? And Space World ups the enjoyment dramatically. No more slow, dark caves. Space is heavy on more active, puzzle-like platforming on timed hard-like constructs, dodging lasers, tilting platforms, and it has fantastic music to boot. For the most part, each stage in this game has its own track, and each world has its own musical identity. They give each world a really different atmosphere. Far Out and Give Me Space are really laid back. Lets you just relax and wash any leftover frustration about Anubis Rex out of the system. All the tracks in the game are also quite heavy on old arcade motifs. They're blended in very well. The boss of Space World is King Galaxian, and it's done via a very basic shoot-'em-up. Not incredibly challenging compared to what we just contended with. It makes for an okay diversion. The final section is tricky but hardly unfair, and it may have my favourite boss track in the game. The next world is a bit more grounded. It's a funhouse. Let's talk about rotation. Funhouse loves spinning in all of its many forms. We've got giant barrels, towers made up of floating rings, hazardous rotating walkways, and most dangerous of all, spinning tops. Since moving platforms influence Pac-Man's momentum by actually giving him a dose of it, the funhouse will be the most direct test of platforming skill in the game. As per usual, level 1 eases you in, and then the following two will smack you upside the head. Now, I actually quite like Spin Dizzy. I think it hits a nice level of difficulty where it's far from impossible, but feels rewarding to beat, and the music pairs well with how often I died. It's strange, it's like a musical version of being mocked. It sounds happy, but you just sort of know that this music is poking fun at you for falling to your death. So as I mentioned, most of the difficulty comes from the spinning tops. Since 8-directional movement doesn't gel perfectly with these, and the fact that even once I grasped how I should be moving from these things, making the momentum work for me, not against me, I still found them to be fidgety things. Plus the side on camera makes setting yourself up for a leap just that smidgen trickier. With analog movement and a camera placed behind the player, it would be far simpler to move with the top, build up speed, and line up the jump. We don't have that though. Spin Dizzy is also relatively stingy with checkpoints. It's not a huge difference, but it's definitely noticeable. Most of the time this game doesn't go long without saving your progress. Anyhow, the boss is a bumper car race versus several clowns. You're in control of a rather fast, very slippery vehicle, and the stage has no railings. It's such a hard stage that almost all of the clowns died, and I therefore took first by taking it slow and steady. This happened on my first go. I consider myself very lucky. If you're of the opinion that bosses in games should be a test of the skills that you've developed, these last two bosses kind of go away from that, and I can see why someone would not like it. These types of gameplay never come up again. They test an entirely different skill set, and they are incredibly basic compared to the platforming that you've been going along with. I feel that this is the biggest example of Pac-Man World coming from an era where platformers wanted to be variety shows that would try out different forms of gameplay. These bosses feel like an artifact of their time, and while I don't dislike them, I've only played each of them as many times as I needed to beat them. I didn't want to replay them as much as the more traditional bosses that we'll be seeing throughout the rest of the series. Factory is a massive step down in difficulty. Its primary gimmicks are burning hot pipes, magnets that carry and drop boxes, and conveyor belts laden with crushers. It's a lot slower paced besides. I found it a bit dull compared to the previous two worlds, but it does have a couple of interesting aspects to it. First of all, the music for Under Pressure became the game's theme song when it got ported to the Game Boy Advance. It's a good track, I haven't played the GBA version, but it's really visually impressive for a handheld title. That does come with the caveat of it missing quite a few of the stages, however. As for what's interesting within the game, the third stage, Down the Tubes, has probably the most effort placed into collectibles and has an entirely different level structure from every other level because of it. This stage has both the key and a caged family member inside of it. If you decide to ignore the family member in progress, the stage exit is a short swim away. However, if you want to free them, you need to navigate and collect everything in a large optional underwater maze, which comprises 2/3 of the total size of the level. This takes it from 10 minutes to 30. Now, this isn't particularly challenging. Swimming is kind of slow, but it's not like we're at risk of running out of air. Pac-Man can relate. The maze is interesting merely for being such a large slice of purely optional content. Getting most collectibles, including the keys, usually comes about by just inspecting each and every part of a stage along the required path, occasionally branching off into side areas. For the most part, however, collectibles lead to backtracking. I'll backtrack to that point later since it affects every world, but let's wrap up the factory proper. It's a slow and easy world that feels like it's been placed way too late into the game, and its boss fight, Chrome Keeper, perfectly encapsulates that. Chrome Keeper stands across a pit from you, booting boxes your way. These boxes contain either health wedges or chrome pellets. To damage the Keeper, you have to hit 5 switches in a short span of time to drop a box on him. These switches are superheated, so touching them will harm you unless you've chromed up. Yet there are also rotating magnets scanning the area, going over each switch. They are easily avoided. If one does pick you up, however, it won't harm you. It will just waste your time. The switches will likely reset, and the process starts again. So, Chrome Keeper is just an incredibly slow-paced boss, and this is the start of a series-wide trend. Bosses in this series just have way too much health. They massively outstay their welcome because of it. Even once you've figured out their gimmicks and can reliably hit them, you've got a long time until they are over. Chrome Keeper, unlike Anubis Rex and King Galaxian, does not advance in difficulty as the fight progresses, so he's very easy to figure out. Then you just repeat a very simple, boring, yet annoying task for a good while. After this, we move on to the final world. It's the Manor, or at least the graveyard outside. At this point, we are truly closing in on Toc-Man's party. You know, the steel drums do not pair well with the creepy wind. It's amazing Pac-Man can still make them out all the way over here. It's a good world to end on, least of all because I'm playing this in October. While it's a step up in difficulty from the factory, it doesn't quite reach Funhouse. Heavy on disappearing platforms, flamethrowers, and ghosts. And the flamethrowers prove as much a help as a hindrance, I'll be honest with you. This world also loves making you run towards the camera, which can be downright terrifying. It just doesn't work well. Throughout a lot of the game, I had no idea whether the front of a stage would have a wall or not, so my instinct was to stand away from it as much as I could. There is something I want to add about collectibles. You keep them when you die, which defeats the challenge in acquiring a lot of these. Many of them are riskier to get back from than to get to in the first place. This can save time if you don't mind tossing a life away. And one last note about music. Creepy Catacombs is my favourite stage track, with Far Out and Spin Dizzy being close contenders. The final boss door will not open until you save Miss Pac-Man, so there is at least one mandatory key in all of this. Before we move on to the final boss, let's talk about the general stage design and how collectibles influence it. As you've no doubt guessed, it's mostly jumping left, right, up and down, dodging foes and timing your way through obstacles. It's basic and fun enough. I wouldn't say it's incredibly satisfying due to how precise character movement is. It means it's not very rewarding since I don't feel like I've had to learn jump arcs or height or anything, it's just too easy to need to master it. The 3D side-scroller thing is a mixed bag. It makes some obstacles utterly toothless since you can just walk around them, yet also makes what should be simple jumps tricky since you're dicing with depth. The stages are probably around 10 minutes long. I say probably since collectibles stretch these buggers out. Fruit doors require a fruit of the same type to open up, and may have pack letters, a Galaxian, progress necessary switches, or even a key behind them. And even if they don't, it may have another fruit inside that is needed to get the key. Pac-Man World doesn't put a lot of effort into actually hiding its collectibles. They're usually out in the open, but they're usually placed an obstacle or two after their respective door. So if you want to collect everything, You will do a ton of stage segments 3 times, twice forwards, once backwards. It is far more rare to see an optional area, and rarer still to see pickups placed behind optional tougher platforming challenges. And even if they are, it's likely you'd then need to backtrack after getting at them. I will admit, I was going out of my way for collectibles because I wanted to. But if I just wanted keys, this would be terrifying. They could be behind any old fruit door, so avoiding anything intentionally is a gamble. It means I'd check every chest, run all the way right and left in every corridor, and try to eke out every nook and cranny. Then, when I found something, I would backtrack. This game gets inventive in how it makes you redo stage segments time and again, usually for very uninspiring payoffs. And while the levels do have individual character, the camera and their blocky design makes actually exploring most of them not terribly interesting, and a lot of them kind of blur together. It's less exploring, more like scanning. Plus, beyond keys, the point of collectibles is score and bonus lives. The high score is a measure of how much you've collected, but collecting things isn't very skillful, since you hold on to collectibles in death. With all that out of the way, let's crash Toc-Man's party. We were invited. The ghosts all flee in fear as Pac-Man arrives, and Toc-Man calls him out for a showdown.
You've interfered with my plans for the last time, Pac-Man!
And the first. So, I love me my rival fights. This one does drag a bit though. I think the best way to describe this boss would be to say that if he had half the health he does now, and if his physics weren't balked, he'd make a really good end to the tutorial. Part of this is that it goes through 3 phases, with each phase corresponding to one of Pac-Man's moves. He throws fireballs, so you dodge his attack and throw Pac-Dots. He butt bounces you, so you butt bounce switches and then him. He rev rolls, so you rev roll. This is not to say he isn't tricky. I took some licks. And unlike previous bosses, we don't have checkpoints, so he gets back his overly long health bar. Oh yeah, the dot throw can be charged. I think the fact I'm bringing that up now shows how often I needed it. That one was my fault. I'm less willing to admit fault on that one. It gets repetitive fast. He doesn't vary up between moves as the phases go on, he dedicates to his new attack. So each of them individually goes on a bit too long. And the physics on the rev roll are so precarious that it's terrifying. It honestly feels better to take a hit than risk dodging them and getting tossed off stage to an instant death. One thing that does make this fight a lot easier is that the family members you've rescued will fly in to top up your health. That's a good few refills I've got going. Toc-Man meanwhile calls in ghosts, but they don't really get in the way. And after a pummeling, that's Toc-Man down for the count. This ending scene is fantastic. We get a really good look into both the ghosts and Pac-Man.
Nobody loves a ghost!
Pac-Man has no mercy. I love it. And that concludes the first entry in the series. It's a flawed start, but I wouldn't say an entirely weak one. The side-on perspective could have worked, but it was set against challenges it's not a good fit for, and the game has a good number of repetitive set pieces with flying rev pads and opening up fruit doors to reveal switches. The collectibles were placed within this camera system, and rather than hiding or challenging the player in finding most of them, they instead test patience. It made you backtrack multiple times to cash in on collectibles, and lengthen the game by just making you repeat sections without a new spin on them. And besides doing them backwards once, on top of this, ignoring collectibles is a gamble between just losing points, which don't matter, and a key, which very well might. The mazes are at their most interesting in the series, but also at their most annoying. The combination of stage hazards and ghosts does not work well together, more annoying as the ghosts can ignore these hazards. The amount of fun I was having world to world changed dramatically along with the difficulty. It feels like it's experimenting with what could work and just trying things out, and as such, the difficulty of the worlds doesn't build naturally. Plus, Ruins and Factory are just on the whole quite boring and rather slow paced. On the other hand, Space, the Funhouse, and to a certain degree Manor are really quite fun, and have some interesting set pieces and very good music. Pac-Man's moveset is small, but each move brings a lot of utility, so you get a lot out of the little controlling the guy. Pac-Man World 1 is a game that's a bit clumsy in basically everything it does, and while it is fun, everything it has done you've probably seen done better elsewhere, particularly if you've played Pac-Man World 2. So we're jumping ahead to 2002, and the second entry in the series is now multi-platform, with releases on the PS2, GameCube, Xbox, and Windows. Still developed at Namco, and my favourite in the series. A lot of design elements from the first game have remained in some form or another, but shuffled around and refined to an incredible degree. It essentially cuts all the fat, leaving a much better paced, to-the-point game than before. Late one night in Pac Village, while everyone's asleep, Inky, Blinky, Pinky, and Clyde fly into town in search of something or other. It's a whimsical scene, but it does back up my growing ideas about the power dynamic between Ghost and Pac-Person. They're breaking in by night. Naturally, they would be worried about getting caught, but their fear goes beyond that. The thought of being seen inspires dread in them. Looking for something to steal, they end up plucking the golden fruit from the tree at the center of the village. This awakens an evil spirit named Spooky from beneath the tree, and he promises that if they follow him, he'll destroy the Pac-People. The ghosts are overjoyed. The next morning, Pac-Man awakes, and as he leaves his house, Pac-Professor comes power-walking to warn him of the danger.
In ancient times, the great wizard Pac created a powerful potion that turned 5 fruit from Pac-Land into the golden fruit that was stolen today. Armed with these magical fruit and a great deal of bravery, Sir Pac-a-Lot faced the all-powerful ghost known as Spooky. Sir Pac-a-Lot defeated Spooky and imprisoned him. And he has remained there until now. Pac-Man, the golden fruit are in the hands.
So, the golden fruit have been left in the care of the ghosts, and Pac-Man must go and collect them, and then defeat Spooky. Okay, this is emulated so it goes by fast, but damn, Pac-Man is in no hurry. He knows he's got this. I know. I live here. Well, this place has an arcade and a museum, both dedicated to Pac-Man, and besides some houses, that's about it. This is a little staging area to toy with your abilities and get acquainted with the pickups of the game. Despite this, the tutorial stage is just down the road, so let's get going. This game has the same structure as the last. 6 worlds with 3 stages and a boss fight each. However, rather than an assault on Ghost Island, most of this game takes place on a jaunt through Pac-Land. We're to hunt down the ghosts and get back our golden fruit, and in lieu of a hub world, we've got a world map. So, this game feels more like a cohesive journey than the last time, with more grounded environments that lead into one another. It's a pretty cool feeling. There is a small drawback in all of this, and that is that naturally it has far more mundane environments. We're not going to space this time around. Pac-Land consists of forests, snowy mountains, and a volcano. The bare basics. Well, it's still a platformer. First, the most obvious difference, the camera. The game now swaps between a rotating camera you can control and a set camera for certain parts of the stage. Unlike the first game, the set camera tends to be angled in a way that's helpful to making jumps in all directions. Unfortunately, the camera still did get me killed quite often. While it is an upgrade, it has brought some new flaws. The free camera is incredibly sticky, often getting stuck on objects, and it doesn't seem to understand falling down, which is a pretty big flaw in a platformer. Thankfully, there is a button to pull the camera in on Pac-Man, and this can occasionally free it. Besides that, it is still fairly easy to make jumps. Pac-Man's control is now a lot smoother, and he actually carries a small amount of momentum, and doesn't quite stop on a dime if you take your finger off the analog. In midair, he can't actually just turn completely. This little change in weight makes the platforming more satisfying overall. Pac-Man feels a lot more natural. Jumping from moving platforms also feels less alien, since now you're always contending with that little bit of momentum. You can still make some bone-shattering turns in midair, and Pac-Man will still grab onto ledges, so it is still quite forgiving. This game does also introduce fall damage, but it rarely comes up. To cap this all off, we're still rocking 4 hit points. It's fine. While we're not any sturdier, Pac-Man's hitbox is now accurate, so he's got that going for him. 2 of the 3 moves return. Pac-Man has discarded the dot throw, since now he's at home, he's hardly going to litter. It's been replaced with a far more economical and even shorter ranged flip kick. It retains most of the throw's usefulness. It's for flying enemies and opening up crates. Most of the time, it's outclassed by the returning butt bounce, which retains a good deal of its power from last time. However, its use as a high jump has been removed. It's now on par with a regular jump. The need for a high jump has obviously gone alongside it. The game has also added shimmying, however it doesn't come up that often. There are only 2 rev pads in the whole of Pac-Land. But that's fine, it just means the fun part of rev rolling gets focus, the part where you go fast. The camera now pulls behind Pac-Man while he revs, so you can aim the roll. You can now also turn mid-roll. On top of this, the rev roll now actually has some physics to it. You still cancel momentum when you jump. That's fine, that's kind of the point. It's also still an attack, and the combat still isn't terribly complex in this game. The most an enemy will demand of you is rev rolling into them before butt bouncing them. As before, enemies are more like obstacles you can smack. This isn't a criticism, it means it keeps the focus on the platforming. Enemies are just there, they get out of the way quickly, and they may have a goodie in them. In this way, they are in service of the platforming and don't delay you from getting to more of it. So, the first world is titled The Forest. It's more like a grassy canyon, and it's listed in the manual as a meadow. Rather wide open, quite forgiving, you'll run across a few bottomless pits and Pac cubs, but besides that, the grasslands around Pac Village are quite laid back. Just watch out for the nettles, those things will sting you. So before we make it anywhere too dangerous, let's talk collectibles. Now that we're not tossing them away, every 50 dots will refill a health wedge. It's a simple enough change. Health wedges remain, alongside extra lives. I didn't expect the function of either to change, and they didn't. This may sound obvious, but I think the sound effect goes a long way in why I still collect every dot I come across. And alongside this, we still have power pellets for taking out ghosts. The Pac-Man letters and keys are gone. Everyone is free this time. It's just that they expect Pac-Man alone to deal with Spooky, and he's more than happy to oblige. Fruit remains, however doors are gone and they've been replaced with chests, which generally just have helpful pickups. They are even more optional than the fruit doors were, but at least I don't feel paranoid when I do miss one. Any non-optional chests tend to have a fruit very close by and hard to miss, making the fact that it's in a chest a little bit redundant. My favourite collectible are the newly added tokens. These unlock new games at the arcade and eventually open up the museum. The selection of games is greater than the original Pac-Man. It's joined by Pac-Attack, Pac-Mania, and if you get 180 out of 189, Miss Pac-Man. So now I can say that not only am I bad at Pac-Man, I also suck at Pac-Attack. Still, more games is a good incentive to collect for me. At the end of the second stage, we get introduced to the Shrink Pellet, which allows us to immediately walk through a hole and exit the stage. And the third stage opens with us on the other side at normal size. The Shrink Dot comes up once more and allows us to walk through another gap. It is never used for anything beyond this. It plays a very small part overall. On note of features that are present yet strangely absent, at Pac Dot Pond we scale up a cliffside and come across a pond. This is the first and last time we will be allowed to swim in this game outside of the tutorial. It works much like last time, only with the benefits of a more open level. Clearing a stage, it's revealed that the slots are gone. So what is the point of fruit and dots? It's mostly just for things within the stage, getting more health and opening up those chests to make life easier. The game does track stage completion and inform you when you've gathered everything of a certain type, but that is mostly for its own sake. I am in favour of this change. I'll also say it now, the music is really good in this game. However, instead of individual stage tracks, each world gets a theme, with each stage remixing that theme. So it's a less varied soundtrack overall, but it does more to push the feeling that Pac-Man is going on a great adventure, while Pac-Man 1 did a better job giving each level a bit more of its own identity and atmosphere. We also come across our first boss, Blinky's Killer Frog. It's a fairly simple encounter. testing if you fully understand how to use the butt bounce and later the rev roll to good effect. The rev roll section is a little picky, but it still does a better job testing these two skills than the HMS Windbag did testing one. After the boss is downed, we collect one of the golden fruit, and that is the final collectible, if you can even consider it one. I mean, these are given out for beating the bosses, which you need to do to progress anyway. So, if you want, you can just beeline through each stage without worrying about missing anything too valuable. It's entirely down to you. Despite the fact I was collecting as much as I could, I enjoyed doing so a lot more knowing that if I wanted to, I could just head to the end of the stage, free of worry that I'd miss anything as important as the keys. So after getting through the oddly named forest, we make it to the Treetops. The first world may have been light on the bottomless pits and, well, Treetops is picking up the slack. It's big on bedoings, ramps from tree to tree, and scaling across branches that have saw blades built into them. This is going to sound like a weird comment, especially on this world compared to the last, but Pac-Man World 2 goes for a far more naturalistic world design. It does a far better job justifying its obstacles as part of the setting, and I think the levels become a bit more interesting for it. Okay, that forest fire risk notwithstanding. Perhaps a limitation of the time, but Pac-Man World 1 stages felt very squared off and boxy. It felt like an obstacle course set up especially for Pac-Man, with enemies and hazards to match. These worlds, while obviously video game stages, feel like places that could exist in this world. It's pretty obvious from the get-go, these canyons and wide open spaces would stick out like a sore thumb on Ghost Island. That little shit spat at me! Besides this, Treetops has some of the most straightforward, no-nonsense platforming we will see in this title, with thin walkways and long gaps. This whole series does very well with basic platforming. It's not as heavy on speed or spectacle as a Sonic game, nor as flexible as Mario in terms of moveset. What World 2 gets absolutely right is basic, fun platforming with a few interesting gimmick stages that actually build off of the core gameplay, most of the time. Despite the absence of water, the chrome pellet's invincibility still has an interesting angle to it. It's primarily used to make certain sections of a stage time challenges. Early on in Butane Pain, we have to stop a potential environmental disaster before we become a part of it. Avoiding damage without the pellet is nigh impossible here. Let's talk about the mazes. This time, they are a lot more standard. No more stage hazards, Pac-Man goes down in one hit, and each maze gives you 3 chances to clear it, which is more than enough. I still don't think I'm good at mazes, but I found these ones incredibly easy, and it's for a rather odd reason. The Ghost AI is incredibly easy to group up, and once they are in a group, they are very easily avoided. If you're watching this video, you very likely already know this, but Pac-Man's Ghost AI was really good for its time. The ghosts each had a different method of pursuit that meant they could ensnare players. Blinky would directly chase Pac-Man, shadowing him. Pinky would attempt to get ahead of Pac-Man and cut him off. Clyde would attempt to chase, but upon getting close would shift gears and act stupid. Meanwhile, Inky would vary between the behaviours of the other ghosts. It's obviously not really AI, they're just all coded to chase you in specific ways. Not to mention, they also vary up between pursuit and splitting off to go to different corners of the map. Here, they all pursue in exactly the same fashion, which means you're only really dodging one ghost, which is quite easily done. I like Treetops overall. After the spacious forest, this gives us our first proper taste of danger. It ends with our second boss, a rather easy affair. Inky's Blade-O-Matic. He doesn't really do much, just kind of flies around, and as he gets some dings, he'll start slowly firing projectiles sort of randomly. You can just rev roll into his mouth, or use the bedoings on the side of the arena to get up top and butt bounce the glass. And that makes 2. Next up is the Snow Mountain. On arrival, we get a warning of ghosts from the local ranger. There was one right outside Pac Village, so I'm not all that surprised. Poor little guy. Snow Mountain is my favourite world in perhaps the entire series. All 3 stages offer something unique, putting a new spin on the platforming. Ice River Run tasks us with scaling up an icy river, making jumps across slick ice to new footholds, or you can rev roll upstream. It's a really fun concept for a stage, and it gives us a nice degree of freedom in how we approach it. This is a little concerning. The ghosts are getting smarter, they've worked out ranged weaponry. I can see the end of Pac Tyranny if they keep at it. Avalanche Alley is probably the weakest of the 3, but it's still a winner, doing some running under duress. This stage provides a nice contrast to how I complained about running towards the camera in the last title, since that comprises large chunks of this stage. In Pac-Man World 1, walking towards the camera on a safe platform was off-putting. Here, sprinting towards the screen with tons of snow piling up your ass is comparatively comfortable. The camera is pulled back and angled down in such a way that I can actually see what's coming and have time to react. This can be a tricky part of the stage, but it's far from unfair. Lastly, Snow Mountain ends with Blade Mountain, a thrill ride of a stage as we skate down the mountain at great speed. It doesn't actually change the gameplay much. You just carry far more momentum, turning is slower, and naturally, you leap further. This isn't a bad thing. It's quite a strength that I can start this stage and acclimatize to the slightly altered movement incredibly quickly. And that's just endlessly satisfying. So there's only one more stage like this, and I'd have taken more. After you clear a stage, you can replay them, and near the start you'll find a stopwatch. This enables a time trial mode, where fruits are replaced with little stopwatches that can stop the clock for a second or two. So if you want to test your times, you're well catered for. It makes a nice addition and gets you some extra tokens. And Ice World ends with our second boss. A slightly less easy affair, Pinky's Revenge. Man, this is some really peaceful music. Oh. So, I did not misspeak. The arena is more perilous and Pinky more aggressive right out of the gate, but besides that, it is the same boss. That's a bit of a disappointing closer. Let's just move on. Next up, Lava World. We're heading into a volcano. The ghosts have an ambush ready, but that isn't stopping us. Lava World comprises the strictest platforming we'll see. A lot of distant jumps to small platforms suspended above certain depth. So, after the variety present in Snow Mountain, this makes a nice return to more typical challenges. We've also got to do some tightrope walking. So, 2 notes about the camera. 1. You can hold down a trigger to pull the camera in behind you and activate tank controls. This is good, particularly for such a challenge. 2, and you've heard it before, the camera is bloody awful. I did complain about it getting stuck, and nowhere will this raise its head more than in the pillar-heavy caverns of Lava World. It's actually the biggest threat you face. It will snag on everything that gets between Pac-Man and the camera like there's an actual bloody rope between the two. This slows down what's otherwise a fine level as you have to wriggle it free every so often. And it's not just the camera working against you. Ledge grabbing joins in on the fun. These collapsing pillars are rendered terrible by Pac-Man's pull-up not actually following the platform. He instead goes Looney Tunes and will pull himself up on nothing. So these platforms actually become harder. This is made more difficult as these platforms collapse. You often have to jump from a lower moving platform to a higher one, so Pac-Man will often think you're falling, grab onto a platform, and effectively kill himself. So, this may be a bit overdue, but due to its simplicity and challenge, this is a good world to talk about how the game uses collectibles. Rather than Pac-Man World 1, where collectibles mostly encourage backtracking, here collectibles are a bit more straightforward. Most commonly, fruits, tokens, and so on are threaded through the stage in hazardous areas, or placed off to the side in more open platforming areas, and usually task you with going through a tougher version of the stage that you are already on. This also ties into what I was talking about with the time trials. Since the fruits are set up to lead you through a harder version of the stage, it makes getting a good time on the trials about taking the harder path. While this game's level layouts are very straightforward, it does also help you navigate your way through a stage. If you see a collectible, that's usually the way forwards. So, if you don't care for collectibles, you can just focus on clearing the level, and you won't lose out for doing so. If you want the goodies, however, you can go the extra mile, and it makes it more rewarding to get them, as it comes about from a challenge of skill. This is along with the fact that you do now lose collectibles on death, and checkpoints do save them, so checkpoints are a bit more valuable. Sometimes I'd miss a collectible, but having nabbed a few beforehand, I'd run to hit a checkpoint and basically bank them before heading back. This game does also make greater use of side areas and going off the beaten path. They aren't exactly hidden, but there's a bit more exploration involved. And usually if they do end in a dead end, or required an obstacle to clear, the game will use a pack trail to cut back on doing the same course backwards. It's a small thing, but it does show how much this game has shied away from wasting your time. Along with this, certain enemies, including ghosts, may have collectibles in them, so there is some incentive to go after enemies. Fruit chests tend to contain items more helpful than absolutely necessary. Chrome pellets to make the next section easier, bonus health wedges, or extra lives. So fruits give you more immediate tangible benefits. The only thing you absolutely have to get are golden fruits, and those are handed over for beating bosses. Speaking of, we come to our second boss fight for the third time, Clyde in the Caldera. So, this time he's more aggressive, the stage no longer has bridges between the platforms necessitating ramping from place to place, and the only way to damage Clyde is to hit his cockpit, so now we have to dodge and wait on Clyde, no more wailing on the boss. Suffice to say, this version is a fair bit tougher. It still is, however, a very simple fight. Every few hits does hand over a checkpoint, however, as every boss in this series gets more forgiving as it gets tougher. It's a very apologetic game. You barely lose progress for deaths. I'd argue this isn't entirely a good thing, but considering how many hits these bosses can take, seriously, this boss has taken about 30 hits over the course of this game, and considering Anubis Rex, I think this game is halfway aware the boss fights take too long. So, I said Pac-Pond would be the last time we're allowed to swim. That's half true, as now we have to. We're on our way to Ghost Island, and they've learned a thing or two since the last time, so now making the journey over is going to be a bit tougher than just nabbing a raft. We are going to be swimming in. Ocean World is just boring. It's got a very simple gimmick, which would be fine if it didn't last half an hour. In Ocean World, you are constantly moving forward, and you just slowly evade obstacles, and you can spin into things. The maze has us running around an underwater base, making me hope for a more typical water stage that will never happen. After 2 stages of swimming, we make it to the Pac Professor's lab. Spooky has sent out a fleet to stop us in our tracks. Fortunately, the Professor has a submarine just for us. Unfortunately, we're piloting it. It's a dull slog through repetitive level segments blasting ghosts. It's not hard, just kinda mindless. It's only 7 minutes long, but bugger me if it doesn't feel longer. The boss of this world is a shoot 'em up stage as well. Just fire a missile up the exhaust when exposed, and don't get hit by a missile if at all possible. So, there we go, that's the last golden fruit. And with that, we can hit Ghost Island and hunt down Spooky. Final world. We're back on Ghost Island, and it's more radical yet less cool than last time. For a start, it's a lot swampier than I remember. The first stage features us rollerblading down a swamp boardwalk, which starts collapsing. It's a really fun ride, featuring a lot of long jumps only made possible by the blades, a lot of close calls and ramping off of collapsing platforms. Just don't try and 100% it on your first time through. It's hell. You have to be quick on your feet for a lot of these collectibles, and know in which order you can collapse some of this place. That's kind of true of a lot of this game. It's quite simple to actually beat, but for 100%ing a majority of it, it can become hellish. The second stage is a short trek through a cave which feels like a reject from Lava World. It's rather short and quite easy. It's a bit jarring and it feels like a bit of a misstep. And this is followed by Ghost Bayou, the final stage in the game. We're back in the swamp, that's for sure, and we're approaching Wormwood, brother of the tree with the golden fruit. Sure. Anyway, Wormwood has a maze that he says we'll never be able to solve. I'm going to be honest, the Wormwood is a tree. He can't move. So I can't hold it against him for not knowing his maze is crap. It's not so much a maze as several very long pathways we have to walk back and forth across, hitting switches and teleporting. It's a lot of running around, not terribly dangerous. There's very little platforming to speak of, and at one point we have to kill a bunch of skeletons, which is quite easy to do. I suppose its most maze-like quality is that everything looks the same, and as such it's possible to lose track of yourself, but it's not very challenging in any regard. And the moment we make it to Wormwood, he's so shocked that he dies. Spooky arrives and he's less than pleased. Wait, he was the heart of Ghost Island? I don't even know what that means. Either way, Spooky declares that Pac-Land will pay, and he flies off to Pac Village to destroy the tree. Pac-Man gives chase. The final world was a bit underwhelming. Even Manor feels like it was building to a climactic fight with Toc-Man. In this, I felt like Pac-Man just bumbled around a rather dull swamp and killed an Ent by accident. The first stage is fun, the second easy and out of place, and the third doesn't really challenge any of the skills you've picked up over the course of the game, and just feels at odds with the rest of it. Luckily, getting back to Pac Village is easy. See? Pac-Man rushes to the tree and plants the fruit before Spooky can spring his ambush from behind that self-same tree. Bit of a crap plan. Pac-Man turns gold, and Spooky calls forth a storm. It's time for a showdown. So, may as well get out of the way, being golden doesn't do jack. Spooky's also a bit of a bore as far as final bosses go. He flies around the arena, summoning enemies with health wedges in them and firing projectiles that take health wedges away, so he evens out. He'll fly away for a while, but when you catch up, you can give him a spin kick. He does eventually start hurling a homing fireball at Pac-Man, but by that point I'd worked out that endlessly butt-bouncing towards him like a gold-coated mixture of Flubber and Jason is something he hadn't really planned for, and as such, Pac-Man kicks an ancient evil to death. So, after getting concussed, the tree opens up and swallows Spooky beneath it, and the villagers come out to celebrate Pac-Man's victory. On the edge of town, the ghosts watch, questioning whether they should free Spooky again.
Uh-oh, let's get out of here!
Wow, that's gruesome. And thus ends Pac-Man World 2. If I was going to suggest playing any one in the series, this would be it. It fixes nearly every problem I had in one. The only flaw that has stuck around are some camera issues, and the boss fights, they still drag a bit. One of them drags over 3 encounters. The collectibles work with the stages rather than stretching them. The platforming has been tuned up and made more satisfying. And besides the ocean, there isn't a world in this game that I would consider a complete bore. This is probably the safest entry in the series, and as a platformer goes, it is a very simple one. But it does simple very well. It's a very upbeat and joyful title. You already know I consider this best in series, but I will say that on some level, I find Pac-Man World 3 the most interesting. So let's jump ahead to 2005. Is it cold in here? What's with the ominous music? And difficulty select. I guess I'll stick with normal. Bring on the challenge.
Junior! 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 Junior, you didn't happen to see the... Oh, thanks, Snooky.
So it's Pac-Man's 25th and people are in a talkative mood.
Did someone say cake?
Oh, even he's talking.
Well, you only turned 25 once.
It just sounds so old.
It seems Pac-Man just can't relax on his birthdays, as before his celebration can even begin,
Is something wrong?
Funny, my Pac sense is tingling.
something is amiss. It seems the ghosts are at it again.
Oh well, at least this birthday's still better than my 20th.
Happy birthday, dear.
These things just kinda happen to Pac-Man. And Pac-Man emerges somewhere, and the ghost responsible rings him up.
The signal's bad here. Some idiot teleported me into a pit.
Is that clear? You shouldn't rush the judgment, Pac-Man. Teleportation is not so easy.
Orson? Is that you? Are you by any chance the idiot of whom we speak?
Orson, for those of you who don't know, was the one who built and piloted Toc-Man 6 years back. So, all things considered, Pac-Man is taking this very well. Pirate docks, green fields, dilapidated rusty nuclear waste bunker, each of these have been an opening stage in the Pac-Man World series.
Rather you than me. Make your way upwards. I'll try to think of some way to help.
What about the monsters? There's usually monsters at times like this.
Well, serendipitously, this place has not only a tutorial, but also cardboard cutouts for the occasion. And monsters. Strange bloody things. Pac-Man World 3 is a 3D platformer with a focus on brawler elements. very light brawler elements. While Pac-Man's moveset has once again survived 2/3 intact, it's all been rebalanced, made more amenable for fighting foes. This also means that rather than going down in one hit, enemies can take a good few wallops. Pac-Man's control is a bit more stiff and rigid, he feels a bit slower overall, though that may be because of the larger stages and to make him easier to aim at enemies. So he's slowed down a bit, but he's no less sturdy, still 4 HP. Let's round up the moves. Pac-Man has lost the spin kick, he's not even trying to be fancy anymore, he just punches things. And he's good at it. The butt bounce returns, former high jump and former world wrecker. It's still useful, only now it has less height than a standard jump, and can only be used 3 times before it creates a blast and you have to start over. So, over the course of the series, through repeated bouncing, Pac-Man has ruined his ass. The Rev Roll has stuck around and is now good for piercing and hitting multiple foes. I don't use it much in combat due to its wind-up. It's still mostly used for platforming and light puzzling due to the return of Rev Pads, now named Rev Plates. I suppose because the T sound is harsher than a D one. The roll now carries momentum when you jump. You never really need this feature unless you're speedrunning the game. I made good use of it exactly once to backtrack for a collectible. It looked cool. Another note that's only useful if you're a speedrunner of this game, Pac-Man's jump height is very slightly randomized. This will never actually hurt or help a majority of players. It just is. Speculate why in the comments. Well-reasoned comments not needed. We're also introduced to wall jumping. It's incredibly automated. You can't really angle yourself with it at all, and only specific spots allow for wall jumping, so it's very rare that you can get inventive with it.
Orson, why am I here?
Would you believe me if I said the whole world was in danger?
Let me get back to you on that, buddy.
Nasty creep named Erwin. Typical megalomaniac. Takes chocolates and kittens. An only child, I think.
I know the type.
It's explained more than once, but a bloke called Erwin is threatening both the real world and the Spectral Realm, now the homeland of the ghosts rather than Ghost Island, I think. Orson decided that if there's anyone who can stop him, it's Pac-Man, so he nabbed him at earliest convenience.
Uh-oh. I'm detecting a rise in energy in your sector, Pac-Man.
Details of my sector's energy should be between me and Miss Pac. Thank you very much.
Well then, there's a joke I never expected to hear in this series. We're assaulted by spectral monsters. They're the sad souls of the underside of the Spectral Realm, and they're getting stirred up by Erwin. Pac-Man complains that they taste bad now. I'll be sure to join him in complaining later, but not quite about the taste. Shortly after, we make our way to the surface, and we get a straight-up level transition. No hub, no world map. Welcome to the Barney Wastelands. Everything is dead and it's filled with more monsters. Okay, so let's talk. You may have already figured it out, or you may already know, but this game originally was not Pac-Man World 3. This project started life at Namco as a title called Pac-Man Adventures. There's going to be a little bit of speculation mixed with truth here. There is evidence in the form of concept art, and one thing I looked into that led me to a creepypasta saying the game opened with Pac Village getting hit by a terrorist attack. I doubt that one's veracity. Pac-Man Adventures was originally meant to be an action RPG title, much darker than the World series and much larger in scope. Don Bluth was brought in to do art and world design for the title, and it's obvious that some of his influence has remained. Well, apart from this, Pac-Man is utterly unflappable. So, Pac-Man Adventures did not happen, and outside of this concept art and whatever Namco had internally worked out for the game, there was nothing to build off of, no engine, in-game models or anything, so the scraps of basically nothing were sent off to Blitz Entertainment to develop a Pac-Man game. Blitz is a British company with a not-so-stellar track record. Fusion Frenzy's alright, but then they did go on to make Sneak King.
You've always wondered, who's behind the mask? The answer is you.
So, I'll say at the least that they were versatile. Now, a lot of recognizable elements from Pac-Man World exist in this game. We still have collectible fruit, the moveset, maze gameplay accessed through a Galaxian. Orson is from the first entry in the series, even if he's essentially a new character here. However, the entire structure of the game and the pace of the levels is entirely different. Instead of the former 6 world setup with stages ranging from 10 to 20 minutes in length and accessed via a hub or world map, this game features 15 stages that average 40 minutes and can go on as long as an hour, maybe more so if you're hunting for collectibles or playing slowly. And after a level is cleared, you're sent right to the next one. This game is also far more dialogue and plot heavy. There will be many times mid-mission where control is taken away for a little cutscene, and lots of plot is delivered through mid-mission banter. It also feels like it's building off of lore that isn't really there. I've already mentioned the Spectral Realm now exists, and is apparently where ghosts come from. And in Pac-Man's world, there's now a race of ancients who have inspired Erwin's plot. The tone and presentation of the story is also wildly different, going from background motivation to front and center. This game exists in between a new IP that never came to light, and a sequel to its own series. For the record, as someone who has just played the entire series for the first time back to back, this is the weakest entry. Not because it's different, but because gameplay-wise, it is weak on its own merits. The dialogue is actually this game's surprising strong suit, even though it took some time for it to grow on me. So, I won't be combining worlds and topics as I did to varying degrees in the last game, since most stages shift location completely, and only on occasion do they directly lead into one another. After we make it to Orson's Outpost, we're brought a bit more up to speed, and we get to calibrate the new Toc-Man. He's pretty basic, you just flail your arms and you can violently spin. It might come in handy. As for the danger, Erwin is siphoning energy from the Spectral Realm to what end we don't know. We don't learn much about the Ancients besides their love of puzzles, their overly large architecture, the fact they can build robot scorpions, and that in the past they did exactly what Erwin's doing now and that led to their downfall. We can put a stop to Erwin's plan by going around breaking down his siphons and then launching an attack on his fortress. Alongside this, Erwin has kidnapped Dinky and Blinky and is currently hunting down Pinky and Clyde, so we're going to try and get them first. This cutscene is fascinating because I know that Erwin is the villain, but between the alien and Pac-Demon, I don't know which is Erwin. It's the first time either is on screen. I only learned later from an unlockable trading card. That's Erwin, and that's the Spectral Fiend, my favourite character in the game.
And if Pac-Man tries to interfere, he shall rue the day he ever tried to interfere!
Wow! Solid ground! I recognize that stuff. I'm guessing I'm miles away from where I actually have to be, right?
Frankly, you could do with the exercise, Pac-Man. You're starting to look even more spherical than usual.
Hey, Miss Pac-Man likes me cuddly, okay?
Anyway, Pac-Man is generally teleported within a mile or so of a siphon, he clambers and combats his way to it, and then shuts it down. We only really learn how many siphons there are left when we're down to the last handful, so some of the early game feels a little bit meandering, and then we're suddenly closing in on Erwin's fortress. Along the way, we also make stop-offs in the Spectral Realm when Orson tracks down Pinky and Clyde and sends Pac-Man to collect them. There is one thing that does unify the stages, and that's the feeling that this slice of the world is dead. Everything is broken, rusted, and decaying. There are bugs everywhere. Annoying little buggers who are not scared of running up and taking a bite out of Pac-Man. Even in the Ghost world. And the noise they make is just unsettling on top of this. The Bunny Wastelands and Canyons are a desert, filled with abandoned mines and ruins. The whole place is in disarray. I mean, the ruins I can understand, but what happened to the miners? Zephyr is a cliffy region in which the Ancients have their catacombs. It does also house an archaeologist town that Erwin cleared out. We do run into an archaeologist who's locked outside of the catacomb. He then tells Pac-Man where the button is to open it, but not the fact that it's guarded. And he's dismissive when Pac-Man brings up that he could well have killed him.
It's a good job you didn't try to retrieve the key yourself.
What sort of a silly head climbs into a pit he knows to be full of monsters?
You knew about them? Why didn't you tell me?
Are you a silly head? My, and you look like such a nice boy. Anyway, at least we can open the door now. Also, this place just feels cold. I didn't realise at first that the particles flying around were pollen. I thought it was a gentle snowfall. Gogeka Central is a shanty town built into an old tower somewhere in the desert, probably the Bunny Wastelands. You only ever meet the town's engineer, and you meet him having been stuck up on a pipe for 2 weeks because of circling monsters, so he may well be repairing a ghost town. There were probably other inhabitants at some point in development. Whether they actually exist now, it's more interesting to think about that. Lastly, of course, there is the Spectral Realm. Orson does tell Pac-Man it looks different for every person based on their individual expectations, so for Pac-Man it's a hellish dump. Orson recalls growing up here fondly and laments its current state, so it being like this may be part of Erwin's doing and Pac-Man's view of ghosts. The stages are also heavy on atmosphere, and the music does most of the work in this regard.
A lot of the game has mellow ambient tracks that are laden with mystery. There are some really good pieces in here. I wouldn't say I enjoy this as much as the previous two games, faster paced and adventurous music, but in this context, it's really good. However, how the game uses music could maybe have used a bit more work. A ton of areas have no music whatsoever, it's just Pac-Man and the wind. I thought it was an emulator bug at first. I had to check other playthroughs and such to make sure that this was normal. What's worse is that this is a genuine problem on the PC port, where it wouldn't play music at some points. Meanwhile, I just thought I was having this trouble. It's an odd choice to not play music everywhere, but not a poor one. It just makes the journey feel very isolated. Yes, these are all praises I never thought I'd be giving to a game about Pac-Man. So, if you look at the level list, besides the final few stages, we're hopping from place to place very often, and the challenges you'll face in each stage can be pretty interchangeable. The Spectral Realm changes it up a little bit, but for the most part, stage to stage, you're not doing much different. Combat happens a lot more and lasts a lot longer in this game. Enemies can take a beating before going down, and the game will often encourage fighting enemy waves before progressing. Encouraging may also mean you kinda have to. And while your options in a fight are expanded, the combat is still very bare bones. Within your three methods of attack, 2 are spammable and 1 is not. The difference in actual power between them is negligible, and your ability to combo between them or mix them up is non-existent. So you can easily win every combat in this game through either endless punch spam or endless butt bouncing. It doesn't matter if enemies crowd you, as long as you just mash and occasionally face a different enemy, you'll swap them away, and eventually they'll meander back in for another. The enemies are very slow to act, rather stupid, and not very aggressive. They border on masochistic. The enemy roster is also on the shorter side. For the most part, you will be up against Armalopes. They have horned and hornless variants, so one of them is only weak to punches and rev rolling, and that doesn't make them incredibly dangerous. Newtonians turn up on occasion, and they wear unused boxing gloves, and they will likely remain that way. K-Trons are the robotic soldiers of Erwin. They're the most troublesome enemy in the game due to the fact they have an awkward ranged attack capable of actually hitting Pac-Man, and the fact they spend roughly 80% of their lives retreating to make these pot shots. Their laser sound effect is incredibly grating as well. It's like a high-pitched firework going off right in my ear. There are robot spinning tops. These are my favourite enemy in the game since they don't actually have that much health. On top of this, the fact they're a spinning top means it's actually somewhat interesting to maneuver around them. You don't really have many means of defense other than just getting out of the way, so this enemy is the best fit for it. The Temple Guardians are metallic scorpions. For whatever reason, they are immune to butt bouncing until you open them up with a punch. I don't think I got hit by one once during my playthrough, since once stunned, they remain docile for a long time, and I know it's a long time, since they are also gluttons for punishment. Lastly, because the turrets are ineffectual, so who cares, there are lummoxes, who are also ineffectual, but it's actually amusing in their case. Their one attack is an easily dodged lunge. Once they lunge, they'll be vulnerable for long enough to get butt bounced to death. Pac-Man World 3 makes the mistake of assuming they'll be intimidating and is thus very conservative about using them, meaning it considers 2 of these a late-stage challenge. So that's every enemy. It's not a great variety, and the game introduces each of them quite early on, so it ups the difficulty by simply raising their health. So fights don't get any harder, they just get longer. Enemies also do not sync up in interesting ways. The most mixing and matching the game does is putting spiked Armalopes in with a different enemy, so you'll have to go from one surefire strategy to a slightly different surefire strategy. Despite that, the game does try and give you more options in the form of additional power pellets. Alongside the returning Chrome pellet is Super Butt Bounce, Ribbon, and Lightning. The Super Butt Bounce is different from its first incarnation in that it's a timed power-up with limitless uses within that window. It slows you down, however, so it's actually a hindrance against K-Trons. Fortunately, the rest of the time, it'll end combat in roughly even time. Ribbon is the most enjoyable. It gives Pac-Man a mild speed boost, and a trail then starts following behind him. When a circle is formed, it collapses inwards, killing everything inside it. It pairs well with Pac-Man, as it's the one ability that's tied to movement rather than an attack, so it works within a similar role to the Power Pellet, and I like that familiarity between them. Lightning, lastly, is too weak to be worth much, except against those spinning top enemies, who pop instantly when hit by it, so I tended to save lightning pellets for them. So, there is a positive in combat. The punches and the butt bounce feel kinesthetically heavy. That's it. They are somewhat satisfying to use. Besides that, the combat is brain dead and lasts way too long. So, that's done. Let's talk about platforming. Never mind. Stages no longer have ghosts just roaming around. However, sometimes vortexes will tear open and spectral beasts will come flying out, and you cannot progress until you chow down. The combat is one of two pace breakers. This one is a bit more egregious. Each gauntlet has 2 respawning power pellets. After you munch on a few spectres, a few more will come flying out, as these operate in waves. However, even if you're still powered up, these newcomers don't seem to care, and you will need to grab a new power pellet. Meaning that even if I was going quickly, I had a lot of downtime waiting for pellets to respawn. Plus, unlike previous entries, hitting spectres in ball form or in the air does not count, so you have to stop and unfurl. That is alongside the game freezing for a moment to play Pac-Man's munching animation. These are small things, but they combine to kill a lot of possible flow these sections could have had. I will say, however, that slight pause is somewhat handy to look around for another ghost, but they're hardly a threat. There wasn't much to talk about with eating ghosts in the last entries. They were there, you saw a pellet, you saw a ghost, you got one, you got the other. Occasionally there might be some distance or platforming between the two, so it was a bit of a test of how fast you were. What the games didn't do was close off the way forward and drop waves of ghosts on you until they were all eaten. The Spectrals do have different forms, ones that charge, ones that shoot, ones that swipe, but it doesn't really matter, they're all the same when you nab a power pellet. And besides that, they are all defeated by a change of elevation, so there's little danger in between being powered up. On top of this, whether or not it would make for a good challenge or not, it never mixes spectrals and regular enemies together to task you with varying up between them. They could have put power pellets in normal enemies, or have the enemies otherwise immune from damage, perhaps inhabited by a spectral, so you need to be power pelleted up to even land hits. That's my boring speculation for what they could have done to make one dependent on the other. So that's done. Let's talk about platforming. It's easy. Okay, there is a bit more to it than that, but I'm going to say this. If you've beaten the last 2 games, you will not be challenged here in the slightest. The levels and platforms within them are incredibly wide, very little precision is needed for a lot of jumps. Stages are also far more vertically oriented. Where previous games would punish failure at platforming with death, many areas now feature multiple levels, and thus punish poor platforming with time, sending you back several obstacles. Fall damage has also been removed, even though it suits this game far better than the second. Plus, even in areas that do have bottomless pits, these now take away a health wedge rather than a life for falling into them, so the platforming is far easier and has very little risk. I don't have a comment about B-doings beyond how harsh that sound effect is. Besides verticality, most stages are also far more open. You won't be tasked with making it through a deadly obstacle course. It's more about exploring a large area and passing the steps necessary to proceed to the next one. One area may require you to collect TNT to drop a rock, requiring you to first find and activate dot trail machines to track down the TNT, then solve a puzzle in another room. The challenge in platforming is more about exploration rather than skillful navigation. There are sections that are all about navigating a hazardous course, but they take up far less of the game. There are new elements. We've talked about wall jumping, but there are also poles to spin from. These are fairly simple, there's no timing to jumping from pole to pole, and the puzzle within them becomes about which order of poles you should jump from to clear the section, and occasionally it's mixed with wall jumping. And there are very light puzzle elements, most of it being about pushing down one pillar to raise another. It only comes up a handful of times, and I've got no comment on it beyond it being there. Overall, the platforming is rather slow and not terribly challenging. There are enjoyable sections. Climbing up the side of Go-Gekka is a fun moment that mixes this game's once again more naturalistic settings with a fun setup for climbing, but for the most part it's navigating open areas to find and put things together to progress. It serves to break up the game's combat rather than just having enemies be part of the obstacle course. So if there's more exploring to be done, then what about collectibles? Well, Pac Dots remain, they are purely for points, they don't even heal anymore and have lost all practical purpose. Yes, there is still a score system. It builds from level to level, and the game has a high scoreboard both for individual levels and total score upon beating the game. Loading a level from the level select will get rid of it. I know that since despite the fact it's pointless, I did this and immediately doubled back to undo it. I guess I therefore care. How sad. This may be the least arcadey title I have ever seen to keep score. Pack trails remain and are now activated via dot trail machines, most of which have to be switched on by collecting a crystal of corresponding colour. Naturally, health wedges and extra lives remain. Fruit is also stuck around, you get points for collecting them, and if you collect all of a fruit in a stage, you get collectible cards to view in a museum. It's how I learned those enemy names, so I can't say they were entirely useless. It's sort of adorable how bad these cards are when it comes to showing off locations. They just aren't big enough. There are no longer fruit chests or really anything of the sort, so fruit is pretty much for the purpose of tiny cards. Medals are gone, however there are collectible cards and 25th anniversary statues, which I think unlock cards. How are collectibles spread throughout the stages? How do they influence how you explore them? Well, they're odd. We've had backtracking, we've had extra challenge, this game has hunting. Sometimes. Sometimes the fruit will just be out in the open, like, here twat man, have a cherry. This game seems to be a big fan of just placing fruit off a cliff. That seems to be its go-to. Sometimes the fruit is in boxes. A lot of the time, if you see a divot in a wall, it's assigned to wall jump up and get a fruit. Sometimes there are hidden areas, like platforming excursions. Once in a blue moon, a rather clever hiding place, such as in a stage where it's hidden on top of a bridge you can only scale if you wait around for the gate you lowered to raise once again. It's very scatterbrained, not terribly inspired. There are also Galaxians, and with them, the mazes remain. It's not just Galaxians, however. Now mazes are necessary to progress.
You need to hack the key to shut it down.
Kinda hard to type with boxing gloves on, Orson.
Good point. How about we try something a little more exciting? Get ready for Virtual Pac-Man!
Wacka wacka!
Mazes are used to hack and destroy the siphons. So, now the mazes all take on a virtual aesthetic, regardless of level. They're also very small and very fast-paced, along with being very forgiving. Like 2, we're lonesome lives in which to beat them. However, along with the 4 power pellets in each corner of the maze, extra pickups are regularly dropped into a stage. Bonus power pellets, speed shoes that make you go so fast you make the ghosts dizzy, and even a vortex which immediately sucks up every ghost. On top of all of this, many stages feature one-use speed boosters that rocket Pac-Man in their direction if you cross them in the intended direction, and you do not lose speed until you hit a wall. You have so many advantages that losing mazes seems harder than winning them. It also has an odd quirk in that ghosts hit by a power pellet come back into play so quickly, it's honestly better to leave them. So, that's what you'll be contending with in most stages. But then we also have the Spectral Realm. We have to save Pinky and Clyde. There are a handful of differences here. For one, besides ghosts, the Spectral Realm has no standard enemies, so they are far more platforming oriented, and are basically the best stages for that reason alone. They also have time keys, and 2 forms of spectral platform. Time keys are little tests of speed. You need to hit each key within a time limit to trigger the keys and progress. I didn't fail any of them on the first time around, and this is not a brag. They give you enough time to take a breather halfway through. Its 2 unique platforms have gimmicks to them. They're either invisible until you come close to them, or they break apart shortly after you step on them, before reappearing shortly thereafter. They are mixed and matched, but they're still rather easy challenges. One of them is beaten with any degree of patience. Fortunately, there are no leaps of faith. The other, much like time keys, give you an excess of time to clear them. I'm going to complain about a missed opportunity here. The Spectral Realm still throws Spectral Gauntlets at you. It's hand-waved by Orson saying that these spirits are from the underside, so them even getting to this point is uncommon. But that's boring. Spectral beasts should have been a standard obstacle around here. Orson could then comment on how siphoning is drawing them to the surface, and thus all his comments about this place falling apart may have held a bit more weight. He even mentions that after the siphons are shut down, fixing this place is going to take time. Gameplay-wise, it could have given these stages a different pace, since these enemies cannot be defeated without power pellets, and then whether or not this place even had power pellets could be played into that, making Pac-Man avoid a threat he can't just punch out. Instead, the same tedious slice of gameplay remains and blights these stages as well. Speaking of ghosts, we're here for a couple of them.
Eureka! I guess.
I think it's the scene where Pac-Man saves Pinky that turned me around on Pac-Man. Up to this point, I'd found his cockiness and attitude annoying. Here, he's sort of earned it, and I enjoyed him beyond this point. The Spectral Fiend, tasked with kidnapping the ghosts, confronts Pac-Man, and I get ready for a boss.
You may refer to me as your worst nightmare.
Pac-Man, quick, pull me up!
Be right with you! You won't push me over the edge or anything if I help Pinky up, will you?
No. Scout's honor.
Don't trust him. He's small, evil, and wants to plug me into a giant energy-sucking machine.
Any truth to that, Mr. Nightmare?
If I said yes, would you hold it against me?
Nah. Look down.
It's a well-worn joke, but it's done well. As for Spectral Fiend, as my favourite character, I'm kinda disappointed with him. He's the dumb rival character, talks a big game but is utterly ineffectual, and I like that about him. He pulls off a good foil to Pac-Man because of this. Both characters are endlessly confident, but Pac-Man doesn't talk a big game, he just gets shit done. The Spectral Fiend, meanwhile, just brags but doesn't actually do anything, and nothing establishes this better than saving Clyde.
Yeah, the big red ghost gets himself all caged up, so the yellow fella gets the mark. Go on then, Munchie, mark away.
Aw, don't take it like that. It's not like I find it funny or anything, Clyde. Well, not much, only a little.
We find him caged up, and after we free him, the Fiend appears and brings with him a torrent of Spectrals. So Pac-Man and Clyde team up and utterly wipe the floor with them, all while Spectral Fiend stands above the arena taunting the two. Clyde then sends the pillar he stands on collapsing into a river. And that's it, he's dead. Clyde just kills him. Third appearance. Second time him and Pac-Man have met, and he's done. He's dead. Pac-Man and Clyde don't fucking play. And while that's absolutely brilliant, it's kind of disappointing. Let's talk about another disappointment. We only recruit Pinky and Clyde. And they're playable, only in select areas. Pinky adds a bit of puzzle platforming. She can make up to 3 platforms material, so you have to switch between them to get Pac-Man through certain stage hazards. She's entirely situational, and only one of her rooms had me scratching my head for any length of time. Clyde is a rough and tumble sort. He's able to blow away enemies, and if charged up, knock down some architecture, occasionally revealing hidden paths and more often the way forward. If you see a Clyde summoner knocking about in an area with enemies, you may as well take it. It's infinite health. That and he's just deadlier than Pac-Man, so he's got that going for him too. So we've got our complete posse. Pac-Man, Orson, Pinky and Clyde versus Erwin and Spectral Fiend. Rest in peace.
Got a bad feeling about this.
I was at first not in favour of this game having dialogue. It came in interesting stages. At first it was because I've disliked characters similar to Pac-Man before, the cocky hero who deflates all stakes in the story. Then we got to the dark environments and I was a bit worried we were going to have awkward drama.
This is a nightmare. I can't fight this.
But it was obvious that Pac-Man and Orson didn't care to get heavy, and I went back to my earlier problem. But then there was the Spectral Fiend scene, and beyond that it made me realise something I should have known all along. Pac-Man is incapable of fear. It was true in Pac-Man World 1 and I liked him then. It's just that now he's got a few questions. And regardless of the answers, he and the audience know he's saving the day at the end of it all, so why pretend otherwise? It's not just Pac-Man and the audience. Orson has complete faith that Pac-Man will come out on top, and to Pac-Man's credit, he's never really angry at Orson and trusts him quite readily. He doesn't even complain about getting teleported away from his birthday. He even seemed amused by it. And when he learns the world is in danger, he gets straight to work fixing the problem. Him and Orson even start exchanging light-hearted jabs, and I like their back and forth.
Never mind, Orson. I've been flummoxed from the start, and I'm doing okay.
You'd never guess this was their last interaction. Pac-Man and Clyde also make a great duo, with Clyde being dumb muscle and Pac-Man the straight man. The two play off each other very well. The environments and the banter do feel at odds with each other at points, but I think they both work, and they don't really detract from one another, and I put that down to the occasional oddballs we meet along the way. This place has clearly affected them. I know all of this is very basic. This is writing for a kid's game, but Pac-Man is likable. Despite being a type of character I often find annoying, at least he doesn't make really lame and awkward jokes. Most of the time. Erwin is okay. He's a pretty standard maniacal evil genius. His spin is that he has to constantly reassure himself and everyone around him of his superiority, which no one really cares for. He doesn't really get angry at Pac-Man beating him. He can't even seem to comprehend that he's entirely outclassed. This game isn't laugh a minute, but a lot of the jokes at least somewhat land. And despite the environments and downbeat atmosphere, the characters keep it a light-hearted journey. The dialogue is outright weak in one regard. Despite the abundance of dialogue, the story is not very complex. There are two central questions. What does Erwin ultimately want, and what were the Ancients? Neither of these provide enough material for how often they're discussed. And there are basically no twists in either. Erwin is basically just insane, and the Ancients were the Ancients. What else happens? Oh yeah, at some point Erwin's army marches on Orson's outpost, so Pac-Man and Clyde pilot Toc-Man to fend them off. After 6 minutes of flailing around and mashing buttons, it's over and the mech is never mentioned again. So, along with Spectral Fiend, that's two things that just sort of disappear. Plus, there are only 2 boss fights in the entire game. We run into Erwin as we make it to the catacombs at Zephyr. The boss fight is very simple, very annoying, and the boss has too much health. You rev up some crystals to lower a shield, then butt bounce on part of Erwin's jet. Repeat for about 15 minutes while dodging lasers and fighting off foes that Erwin drops in. There's a big feeling throughout this game that a lot of what's here was meant to have a lot more presence. Besides what I just mentioned, there's the Ancients, the new Spectral Realm, a pre-existing rivalry between Pac-Man and Clyde that just sort of appears. Pinky basically gets zero interaction with Pac-Man after you save her, she just appears in gameplay and says nothing. There's the fact we even only get Pinky and Clyde, the other 2 ghosts spend the entire plot in Erwin's clutches, saved off screen in the ending. It feels like there are huge chunks of this game that are missing, and that's ignoring the bare-bones nature of the gameplay that is there.
Ah, ain't these chaps just the cutest? See them scamper, little legs all skittering. Can you bring me a little one for a pet?
My growing respect for you, Clyde, doesn't preclude my pointing out that sometimes you're just plain weird.
Okay, so after we hack enough siphons, it's time to launch an assault on Erwin's fortress. We run into a man who broke free of Erwin's prison. He then claims he's a hero who has stood up to Erwin by breaking free. Pac-Man largely lets him believe this, and as we make it deeper into the fortress, Erwin gets on the horn, and recognizing his voice, points out that he's actually the janitor. Orson then offers him a job cleaning up the outpost. So I suppose he has a happy ending? Pac-Man is largely indifferent to the deception, and it's knowingly treated as the non-twist that it is. We continue our assault, scaling the outside walls in the oddly named level Dungan Gundan, before learning of one final siphon set up in the Shadow Temple, which can only be accessed by hopping between the real world and the Spectral Realm. So in a last moment reveal that no one really brings up and it doesn't really get treated with any importance, but the Spectral Realm must at least somewhat correspond to the real world. Anyway, we make it to the Shadow Temple, and the final boss is an easier version of the previous boss. I mean, sure, there are 4 crystals instead of 3, but the fact he doesn't spawn enemies and instead just has a couple more attacks, both of which are easily dodged, means the final boss just goes down with a bit of patience and a lot of running in place. The reveal is that Erwin was siphoning energy to plunge both worlds into darkness. And while both worlds were in darkness, he was just going to sit in his machine while his robots took over the world for him. With Erwin's machine destroyed, he retreats up to the siphon, with Pac-Man following close behind.
You should have used your death machines, world conquest plans, and rampaging insanity for good instead of evil.
It's finished, all right.
Erwin still thinks he's got a shot at winning, and Pac-Man just seems vaguely amused.
Well, yes, it's entirely possible when one considers things have not been going well. What am I saying? Even now, my magnificent machine is poised to bring about the collapse of the Spectral Realm and give my legions all the energy we need to. Why are you looking at me like that?
Always keep your feet on the ground, Erwin.
That's really fucking cold there, Pac-Man. With the world saved, Pac-Man is teleported home. But there is one last issue. With the Spectral Realm still in disarray thanks to Erwin's machinations, the ghosts don't have a home.
Hi, Mrs. Munchie! We're sorry to drop in like this, Miss P, but we had nowhere else to go.
An insane little man with unresolved issues attacked the Spectral Realm. But he fell into a beam of raw power, so he won't be doing that again soon.
Aw, beams of raw power are cute.
Anyway, Orson's working on fixing up the Spectral Realm. We'll only be here a while, a few weeks, or months, tops. What's for dinner?
You are.
You heard the lady. I believe now's the part where you run.
Yeah, that's the thanks you get for trying to save the world. And I guess that's the lesson we'll end the series on. Pac people are big racists. You can't say Blitz didn't pay attention. So, to restate, this is the weakest game in the series, but I still find it very interesting. I can't recommend it as readily as the other two unless you enjoy these sort of oddities that I do. The platforming has been simplified and slowed down dramatically, the combat drags and the collectibles are pointless. I got first place on the scoreboard, so I'm allowed to say that. It felt like two incomplete halves have met. The idea of what Pac-Man Adventure's story might have been, darker world, heavy dialogue, mecha combat, multiple playable characters, then it was mixed with fragments of the World series, the lighter tone, the moveset, collectible fruit, Pac-People cruelty. It's a terribly slow game and its strengths lie in comedic dialogue and an oddly well done downbeat atmosphere in its level design. I liked parts of it, and I can see someone out there liking the whole, but I also know there were other games coming out around the same time that were doing the same thing but better. I got massive Jack vibes from this game, and that's ultimately the problem. If you like the previous entries and want more of that, this game will not give it to you. This isn't Pac-Man World 3, it's simply too different. So before we conclude proper, I want to wrap up how I feel about ghosts and Pac-People. So the ghosts either live on Ghost Island or the Spectral Realm. They live peacefully alongside skeletons, have built a kick-ass amusement park, and they've made it into space. As both 1 and 3 show, they are pretty good with technology. Orson has worked out viable robotics and teleportation, plus the ghosts have an actual personality. The Pac-People live in a shitty little village, worship a tree, can't tell the difference between forest, a grass canyon, and a meadow, and they use their technology to idolize themselves. They're so basic that their names are all variations on Pac-Man, replacing man with whatever the hell they are. Plus, they don't have a theme park. They've barely built up the place at all. However, the natural world is rife with power pellets, and Pac-People can carry them around at all times. All pellets seem to do is make a Pac person's touch debilitating to ghosts. The Pac-People come off as brutish and violent, and the ending of 3 reveals there's this impregnable divide between the two groups, as even when ghosts help to save the world, they're immediately tossed aside the moment the quest is done. Also, Pac-Man and his family can hunt them for amusement. I feel bad for the ghosts. We know in the first game they threw the first stone, but how far back does that go? They're clearly scared of Pac-Man by reputation. Going into Pac Village is a scary venture for them, and in reverse, Pac-Man sees their home as a terrible place, but he walks through it unafraid. I'm going to choose to believe I'm not overthinking this, because the relationship of the two groups sticks out to me. It's not as clear-cut as some other video game rivalries. Despite being the villains, the ghosts are the underdogs. And that ends the Pac-Man World series. We didn't cover the side games like the Portable Ports, Miss Pac-Man's Maze Madness, and Pac-Man World Rally, but we've gone through the core of it. And it's tough for me to draw a conclusion. One felt like throwing a bunch of ideas at a wall. It doesn't seem to understand or work within its own weaknesses, and one boss seems to incorporate every flaw in its gameplay at once. Not intentionally, the boss just didn't have enough time to be tested. But while it flounders a lot, I don't believe it's a bad game. I would recommend playing it casually and just looking up how to find the keys. Some of its platforming is good, but it's covered in a layer of muck that can slow you down if you decide to dig through it. It's also the toughest of the lot, but most of that toughness comes from rather unfair moments. 2 refine that perfectly by removing and simplifying a lot, and just leaving what was fun. Now collectibles are rewarded within the level, and incentivized taking on extra challenge and paid you back for doing so. While the new camera did have its own issues, it's still a step in the right direction. It has flaws in how it recycles the same boss 3 times, and one of the worlds is rather dull. But that's hardly that bad when the rest of the game is at least fun. It learns to respect your time while still rewarding your efforts. Then 3 feels like it's turning up late to emulate the platforming brawlers of the PS2 generation, and along the way it learned that Pac-Man exists. 1 came out when 3D platformers were finding their feet. They were collectathons and variety acts. Platformers had gimmick stages. In some games, entire gimmick stories. 3 came out when a good few platformers wanted to be brawlers, and they typically weren't very good at it. And Pac-Man 3 is just as bad, if not worse. It can't learn from or improve from 2 since it isn't trying to. The Pac-Man World series never set the world on fire, but it got its following, particularly Pac-Man World 2, and if I was going to fall in with anyone, it would be them. It's a boring conclusion, but this series excelled at simplicity. When it took me away from the platforming, I was often left wanting to get back to it. Many of its diversions just didn't hold up compared to how fun it made not falling down a hole. So, I just called roughly 70% of the playtime in Pac-Man World 3 a diversion. Despite that, I would recommend checking them out if you enjoy platformers. Each title has enjoyable moments, a lot to draw from, a good few unique ideas, and they thoroughly deserve to be remembered. If you enjoyed this video and want to support me in making further episodes of Playing, please support me on Patreon. You can get access to my scripts and afterthought videos where I answer viewer questions and requests. A thank you to my patrons Eric Nace, DBZ King 119, Noonan, Sigurd, Damascus, Armin Reddy, Austin, Wagman, Alt F4 Games, Samson, Arthur D. Gonzalez Martin, Johnny Z, Corrupted, Cagus Jalneonis, Son of Cinder, Zio, Nick Marrow, Jonathan Gutierrez, Wrights, Erwin, The Tried Piper, Tom Hughes, Brenicium, and Jonathan Hume. Please send me your afterthought questions either here or on Patreon if you're in the $5 bracket, and I hope you'll all join me next time.